Hello. Welcome to another episode of The Horrific Podcast. We're two friends who live in different places but share a love for scary movies. Each week we both watch the same movie on our own and then record a conversation together about what we liked, what we hated, if we were scared, and maybe even some larger truths about why people watch horror movies in the first place. This season we're going to be focusing on horror subgenres and how they've changed over time. Hope you enjoy it, and thanks for listening. We're doing it.
Hey.
First real episode of season 13. Back into the swing of things, and it feels so right.
It just feels good, man.
Yeah. In case anybody hasn't listened to the season 13 intro, the style this time around is going to be a little bit different. We are focusing on like 5-episode runs on a specific horror subgenre and how it changed over time. And so we're starting with zombies, and this week we're going to review the movie White Zombie from 1932, but we're also going to talk a lot about sort of what was going on in the early days of zombie films.
Yeah.
I don't mean this the way that it's going to sound, but I'm actually a little disappointed to be starting this way. We're like 1 minute into the first episode and I'm already complaining. But this movie's been on my list for a long time, and I'm definitely glad I watched it. But for the purposes of this season, I really wanted to start off with another movie called The Plague of the Zombies from 1966. Mm-hmm. Because a thing that we've talked about before that I think is really important to telling the story of zombies in film is that before Night of the Living Dead, zombie movies were a totally different type of thing. Mm-hmm. They started off, and this movie is a great example of it, as more of a witchcraft, voodoo, kind of evil spirit magic type thing. Not like a biological thing. Mm-hmm. And it was centered around, a lot of times, someone who was conducting that magic or doing the voodoo. So it was almost like a thing that people did to each other, almost more like what some of the vampire mythology is, where you have like the head vampire that turns other people. It's almost like that, except that the person doing it is like a witch doctor or something rather than a zombie making more zombies. And so this movie is an exemplary example of that, the very first example of that we have on film. But I really wanted to get one that was still in that vein from closer to the time that Night of the Living Dead came out. But all of the examples that I tried to get to were not available for streaming anywhere. And I think there is probably something to do with like licensing, or somebody is negotiating a contract or something about making those available, because when we were talking about doing this originally, some of those movies were available for streaming, but they now are not. So all that to say, I really still want to see the movie The Plague of the Zombies, but there wasn't a good way of getting it for in time for this episode.
Yeah, and when you've been doing this for so long, we've been burned by buying like physical copies, definitely on FBI lists.
Oh yeah.
So for us, it's like, hey, let's just adapt and overcome. And that's what we did in this situation. Yeah.
Switch to Tubi and everything will be fine.
You're dang right. Yeah. 100%.
So yeah. So anyway, but yeah, this movie still makes the point well. It's still a good example of, something that is the way that filmmakers thought about zombies for a long time.
Right.
And like I said, has to do very much with, voodoo and curses and things like that. And so this is a movie that takes place in the Caribbean. It involves Bela Lugosi as a voodoo master, I guess. Or, I don't know if you'd call him a witch or what. But anyway, so it's just kind of a perfect sampling of what the original mythology around zombies were. So I'm excited to dig into that more, but I will introduce it, and then you can do your fun facts, and then we will get into the reanimated details.
Perfect.
In 1932, United Artists brought us White Zombie, which is widely considered to be the first feature-length zombie movie. Taking inspiration from both a novel and a Broadway play, White Zombie stars Bela Lugosi as a voodoo master who commands an army of zombies from his plantation on the island of Haiti. This movie was made on a budget of around $50,000 in 1932 money. It was not critically acclaimed at the time, but it has gained fame over the years for being the origin of zombies in film and can currently be streamed for free on Tubi. What did you learn about this movie?
Learned quite a bit about this film. So, this is obviously one of the first zombie horror films to be produced. As we all know, it's based on the novel The Magic Island, written by William Seabrook. Which is just, if you're going to be a writer, that's the name to have. I'm just saying, I like it. Bill Seabrook. Here's my card. I'm an author. Would you read that book or not?
I'd read it twice.
It's proofs inputting name. So, did you know that there's actually, so a lot of the, I don't want to say a lot, but there's supposedly a case of a Haitian man who claimed to have been turned into a zombie by Haitian voodoo. His name was Claverius Narcisse. I think I said that right. Like, you can look him up, read up on him. He lived from 1922 to he died in 1994. But supposedly this was the case. I'll leave it up to everyone to believe it or not. Kind of interesting. The other thing I thought that was like super, like really interesting about this, they actually named this film over Rob Zombie's first band that he had. The first band was named White Zombie. That's all I could think of was where this name came from. So
wait, they named the film after his first band?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I did all the. Yeah, I checked it all out. You guys don't have to.
Rob has the trademark. So.
Sorry. No, but yeah, so like we were kind of talking about, this one involves, different flavor, different seasoning of zombies, which is the black magic style zombies. Although Bela Lugosi, who's in this, he actually regretted that he had only got paid $800 for the film, because they considered it to be a successful box office for the makers of the film. And the last, one of the most important facts is the film was thought to be lost until it was discovered in the 60s, which I assume is why we have different versions of, or different, like if you look it up, you'll see different descriptions for the same film. Who knows? There's a court battle between film distributor Frank Storrs and the estate of Stanley Krillberg, the film copyright owner of the film. Basically, they found it, they restored it. The estate refused access to the original footage. They, as in the film distributor, Frank Storrs, gave up the court battle, and did not win access to the original footage. So basically, it went on like a 30-year hiatus, which makes sense because there was like a whole bunch of home, TV or movies or anything happening during that time.
Yeah, it was all like the original film in canisters that had to be stored and handed off.
Right, which then got me thinking though, if it was more readily available and played more frequently during those 30 years. Would our style of zombie films be different today than what they currently are? I don't know, but considering this is one of the first on film, one would have to think. But yeah, those are the facts I have for White Zombie.
That's an interesting thought, and I kind of wonder too what it would be like if, would some of these older movies have the same reputation if they had been more readily available for a longer time? Because I know Nosferatu was considered lost for a long time, and then it gained this, mystique around it as the first zombie movie that no one had, the first vampire movie that nobody had seen, and all that. And then you kind of wonder if it had just been available, would it have built that same reputation? Like, if anybody could just go watch it anytime, would it have had the same mystique around it? And I think that this movie probably has benefited, from sort of the long-term success of the zombie genre. Mm-hmm. And probably for times not being available or being harder to find has maybe contributed to the mythology around it a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, because, zombies, the actual thing of zombies, wasn't new. Obviously, if this movie is based off of a novel, then that tells you one thing there. But one of the facts I was reading about zombies was talking about the ancient Greeks. They feared zombies so much that they would basically weigh down, like in burials, they would like weigh the bodies down with rocks or like heavy objects to make sure that the skeletons don't come up from the grave.
Wow.
So like that's the ancient Greeks, so like this isn't new, but still, I think for the modern age, like this is probably some of the first times any of us had seen it in the 30s.
It was telling that there was the part where, like, the driver of the carriage in the beginning had to explain what zombies were, to the other characters, but also to the audience.
Exactly.
Like it definitely was a deliberate thing where they worked that in, kind of like how Bram Stoker's Dracula, the novel, like introduced this whole concept of vampires and the idea of Dracula and what he was and what all these things that would become stereotypes of the genre but didn't exist yet. A lot of that had to be kind of spelled out for the audience so that you could follow along and know what was happening.
Yeah. And, I think something that's also pretty interesting for me with zombies is the fact that like different cultures have like their own kind of version. So like even in Haiti right now, like, I mean, I don't know if it's still a thing, but like at one time, like it was illegal. Like there's a law against turning people into zombies, yes. and the person who I mentioned, Claverius, who I hope I pronounced that right. The guy who claimed to have been turned into a zombie. Like even with that happening, like I feel like that's still a different style of zombie than what the ancient Greeks had, back what they thought of to what Native Americans had, in their history. Like zombies is just like this overall thing. So what we're kind of getting into with these like 5 pieces is like helping pull all those cultures in together to like one. Now zombie to us in the modern world is pretty similar, I feel like, in the sense of, media has helped define all this for us. Mm-hmm. And that's why I'm just getting excited about doing these episodes, because it's like, well, zombies mean something totally different to Haitians than it does to us initially, but now it's kind of defined by the same thing. And I think that one day we're going to have a film that's out there that's going to pull in like influences from different kind of cultures that's going to kind of change the zombie game to what we see it today, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, and you may also be foreshadowing a little bit of the point we'll be making in the 5th episode of this one. So, yeah, good stuff. It's interesting. I think in watching this movie, one of the things that stood out to me most was what wasn't there. There was no brain eating. There were no, zombies sort of eating human flesh or chasing people on their own. They really were the almost like servants, kind of like mindless drones for Bela Lugosi. Mm-hmm. So it's almost just like you have this witch doctor that has this sort of army of servants that he can control like puppets. And, it got into a little bit of like, is there still some humanity in there? Are they able to, process what's happening and like resist his control? But it was a really interesting thing to me how different they were on like every assumption. Like if you ask someone just to describe a zombie today, I think really the only thing that these ones had in common was that it was, a dead person that has come back to life in an altered state.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, it was like, I don't know if it was a little bit difficult going back and watching, like, we already know what we think zombies are, right? And so, like, going back and watching, like, this different version of them, like, it was kind of interesting for me because it's like, even though, like, I've seen this, I actually own this on, like, DVD. It was part of, like, one of those packs that you can buy, like a 10 zombie film thing.
Right.
And, anyway, so, like, still interested in it, but like to a certain extent, it was almost a little bit difficult. One, we're so used to seeing Bela Lugosi as Dracula, you know, so that was kind of difficult in a way because like such an iconic, like I firmly believe that he was made to play Dracula. Like it just was amazing.
You think anybody in history has had scarier eyes? I feel like
No,
this movie and that movie spent like half the runtime just focused in on his eyes.
100%. Right. But you know, it was kind of interesting to go back and watch it because it was like, you know, we're almost having to recalibrate like our thinking of it, of zombies as well. But, you know, because the thought is like, well, in this, like if we're looking as far as categories go for horror, it's like, is this like a Frankenstein situation where, you know, Dr. Frankenstein's the real monster of, you know, and Bela Lugosi is as well. And like in a way, it also has like a hive mentality, situation to it as well with, you know, you take care of the head guy, it would take care of all of the zombies. But, yeah, it's just like that's why when we say like we're so excited to get into this, like this is why, because it's like dissecting it even further for us and you know, really exciting.
Yeah, it was also nice that they imported Dracula's castle on the hill to
no kidding, huh?
have the finale.
It was a nice atmosphere, I'm not gonna lie. Yeah. I mean, because like when you start watching this, like and going back, like it is difficult to follow. Like that's coming from a guy who watched it twice within 2 days, you know, make sure that he was watching the right version. Yeah. Like it was, you know, a little difficult to follow and understand to extent, you know, but, because I feel like with some certain zombie films nowadays, it gets a little easy to follow. Like, you know what the deal is.
Yeah, sure. You know, and that's definitely a thing that I was talking about. It stood out to me how there were a lot of things missing. You know, you didn't really know like what the rules were because we are so ingrained with all of the zombie tropes of the last 100 years that when we have something that's different, that you can't just use the mental shortcuts that Hollywood has built. You do have to pay a lot more attention and try to think through like what's happening and what can they do versus not. And, you know, how dangerous are they? And like, she was dead, but then she came back from the dead as a zombie, but then she was still in there somehow and then was alive again. Like, what? Like, the following was difficult. And it didn't help that I feel like this movie was from 1932 and definitely still had one foot in the silent movie era. Like even the fonts and stuff in the beginning, I was like, oh, will this have sound? Or dialogue.
Dialogue, yeah.
And so there was just kind of it was really hard to hear a lot of it. It also was kind of that early, we're just putting people in front of a camera and loosely communicating a story and pulling off some cool visual effects and calling it a day. You know, it wasn't like a really thorough script that got into, you know, defining, you know, a super nuanced plot or anything.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I think though, as far as like the atmosphere goes, there's just something special about these old horror films that
absolutely.
has such a amazing kind of feeling while watching. Like I just felt like I was back and, you know, it was starting to feel like fall in a way while watching it, you know. So that's the one thing that I don't think was intentional, but like that's 100% what they succeeded at, was making one that
feels like a horror movie.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's kind of hard to do, I feel like sometimes, especially can be with zombies in a way. But yeah, that was definitely something accomplished.
Yeah, and I thought this one pulled off actually some kind of cool visual effects. Like, obviously, they didn't have a lot of technology, and it was made on a pretty low budget, but the thing with, like, Bela Lugosi's eyes hovering over the screen kind of in the beginning, and then Madeline, like, the ghost of or vision of Madeline showing up, like, in the shadows and reflections and stuff when the husband is at the bar, and then seeing Bella, like, from the servant's point of view.
Yeah.
Like when he's like starting to take control and like he starts going out of focus, like there were just some neat things they did that I feel like were really creative within the limitations of what they had to work with. And so overall, I think it's totally worth watching.
Yeah, 100%.
And especially if you want to get a feel for what zombies started as in film. And I think that'll kind of help. It helps tell the story of how things got to be where they are today if you know where they started.
Yeah. Yeah. At the end of the day, zombies for the most part are, pretty just driven towards like one main thing. I almost want to say like brain dead in a way, but like they have like just one thing, this motivation, or, maybe it's voodoo that's making them be simple-minded, I guess, if that's a thing to say. But that's like the case for all of them. Like at the end of the day, the 28 days later, fast zombies want to kill. They have their one thing. You have the others that want brains to eat your brains. Like it's all just motivation, but like there's nothing else that they're thinking about except for that. So it's just a constant force coming at you. So at the end of the day, it's like the meat and bones of it is similar. This is just like, where did the zombies come from? It wasn't toxic spill or whatever the case this time. It was voodoo magic.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's kind of one of the things that stood out to me is like a distinct thing from this time period that I think is really noticeably different. Is just sort of like the motivation of the zombies, which seems like a silly thing to talk about. But in these early movies, the zombies were being motivated by the control of another person. And that, to me, in some ways, is like a little bit less scary than what they eventually would become. Because as we saw in this one, you take out the leader and then the danger's gone. Whereas, the idea of something more like 28 days later or kind of more modern zombies is that, it's like a plague. Like one zombie bites another person and that person becomes a zombie and it just spreads and they're all sort of autonomous in a way that you're not going to win until they're all gone and you never really know like how far it spread. And so it just kind of an interesting thing that this being a horror genre, the creature over time has gotten scarier is a cool idea.
Yeah, I think it definitely has to evolve. We could see evolution taking its place there. Because at the end of the day, like if we had reproduction of the same, proof's in the pudding, I guess is what I'm saying. So like we started off in the 60s with the slow zombies and then look where we got to now. Like you have to have some sort of evolution or else it's just going to flutter out.
Definitely. And so over the next 4 episodes, we're going to look at some of the zombie movies that have come out since this one and kind of bring up to the modern times and really focus on kind of what were some of the big turning points or some of those big evolutionary steps for the genre on the whole. And so next week we're going to be back and we will be revisiting Night of the Living Dead, which we've mentioned several times, which is going to be mentioned several times anytime you're talking about zombie movies.
Has to be, yeah.
But hopefully this episode has sort of laid the groundwork for explaining why it was significant at the time, and that'll be a fun discussion.
Yeah, and if you're anything like me, I'm not too proud to admit this. The whole time I was watching this film, I just thought, I like the way they talk. They just talk real proper. I was like, I wish I talked like that. I like the way you talk.
The way I talk.
Yeah. I thought that, dude. I really did. I was like, man, there's something crazy about that speech pattern.
Yeah, I I was too distracted by the vulture that screamed like a woman being burned alive to really
that wasn't
notice
a person?
much of the rest of the sound.
Oh, shoot.
That was terrible.
Yeah, man, it was awful. But my first version was like super loud. The second one was pretty mild, so maybe.
Oh, I get the loud one. Yeah, for sure. I mean, it was just like unsettling when it would happen.
Yeah.
So, yeah. But yeah, this was a good one. I'm glad we watched it. Like I said, I wish we could have done the other one, but I did have a list of some movies that were like candidates for this. So we already did an episode on I Walked with a Zombie, which is very much in this same vein. But then there's another one called King of the Zombies that I believe is pretty much the same. There's another one called Voodoo Man that's kind of in the same realm. And then, like I mentioned before, The Plague of the Zombies was really the one that I wanted to watch for this week because it was in 1966. So super close to the time in 1968 when Night of the Living Dead came out. And I thought it would be really interesting to be able to compare those two directly. But sometimes when life gives you lemons.
What?
You watch a movie that I can't say the name of because Rob Zombie owns the copyright.
I knew that was the case. Yeah, Rob ruins everything.
And that's it for today's episode. If you've listened this far, then thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed it. We're always looking for new ideas, so if you have any questions, comments, or movie suggestions, please send us an email at thehorrificpod@gmail.com, or feel free to comment on or message our Facebook page. Just search for The Horrific Podcast. Thanks for listening.
With Bram, is it Stoker or Stroker?
Stoker.
It's probably not Stroker.
I mean,
Now that I say it out loud.
Yeah, Stoker. I think it's Bam Stroker, actually.
Oh, I'm a child, but that got me.
You asked the wrong guy for that one.
If you Google Bram Stoker,
Bam Stroker, you're going to end up on another FBI list, I think.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Sorry, I'll get it together.
Please don't.
Kind of like how...
Sorry. I'm in mute. I'm sorry.
I couldn't do it.